Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start this morning by asking you just to close your eyes, please. And when you do this, I'd like you to envision the place that you call home, wherever that may be. And I don't necessarily mean the house that you live in, but a place that gives you a sense of comfort and grounding and connection. And I'd just like you to try to be there just for a moment. And I'd like you to imagine that a transformation happens in this environment that starts to change the characteristics of this place that you've known and loved, that's given you this sense of comfort, such that you don't quite recognize it. It doesn't feel familiar to you any longer. Now, depending on what causes this transformation, this feeling might be difficult to articulate and express. It's complicated. You can open your eyes. I'd like you to take you to a place this morning where that's not an imagined situation, it's becoming a form of reality. This is the Upper Hunter Valley. It's this beautiful, idyllic river valley about 3 hours north of the city of Sydney in Australia. And for most of its history, it's been known for beautiful things: thoroughbred horse breeding, dairy farms, wine vineyards. But in the late 1990s, there was a discovery of high-quality coal underneath the valley floor. Big companies came in and started digging big holes to get at it. Holes like this. This is the Mount Thorley Warkworth mine in Singleton Shire. It's a massive, massive hole. It's visible from space. They started opening mines like this all throughout the Upper Hunter. And with it came this sort of associated, transformative physical attributes. All in this quiet place. This is Glenn Albrecht. He's an environmental philosopher. And at the time, Glenn became interested in the emotional dimensions of what was happening to communities that were living around these mines. And as the mines expanded, the word of Glenn's interest in them and that experience started to spread, and his phone started to ring. And on the other end of the phone were people like Wendy Bowman. Wendy'd lived most of her adult life in the valley. She's been involved with a dairy farming family, and she was beside herself. She was fighting with mining companies that were trying to acquire parts of her property. She was serving as an informal counselor for all these other people who were going through a similar experience. She couldn't sleep at night. She was carrying this sense of emotional weight day and night. Glenn got calls from people like John Lamb. He's a tough guy. He was a former soldier. He thought issues of mental health and emotional well-being were for the weak, that he was in control of his experience through the energy of his mind. But as these holes got bigger, something in John broke. No matter how hard he tried to keep his energies up, as soon as he'd confront these mines, his heart would just drop into his feet. He started driving 20, 30, 40 kilometers out of his way to avoid these confrontations. Glenn started to get a lot of these kinds of stories, and he started to notice this commonality among them. People knew that the mines were the source of their distress, but they had a very difficult time articulating this feeling. It was almost like a sense of homesickness. But nobody left home. It was almost like their homes some essence of their homes had left them. And it wasn't really nostalgia either, because it wasn't purely looking back at golden days gone by. This was about something being lost or something kind of being taken in the present, and that had implications for the future also. As far as Glenn could tell, there was no word to describe this experience. And without one, people in the valley couldn't explain how they were feeling to other people, and they couldn't really even make sense of it to themselves. So Glenn sat down with his wife and his intellectual partner, Jill, and they decided to name it. Enough of this. People are experiencing it. They can't express it. We have to name it. So they started thinking about what exactly was underway. What was this feeling that people were having? Well, there was a pain, a sort of longing, an algia, like nostalgia, the pain to return. And this pain related to people's homes, And what are our homes, really? They give us a sense of comfort. So Glenn was thinking, okay, comfort, but how could I modify that word into a new word to describe this? Well, they got out this book of synonyms and antonyms that Jill had had from her school days. And they looked up the word comfort in there. And there they found a synonym, solace, to have a sense of peace. And Glenn thought, I think that might work. So in a paper in 2003, Glenn started to call this complex emotional experience of losing this sense of place, he started to call this solastalgia. And it's since become known as this idea of an existential or psychic sense of distress that's brought about by unwelcomed or negative changes in a person's home environment. People started talking about this. They started making art about it, writing poetry, having conferences. And I heard it years later in a film, a National Geographic documentary film, in my mother's living room, tens of thousands of miles away from where it originated. And I thought, wow, what an interesting idea. This was a new frontier in sort of examining and charting our experience in this changing world. And it wasn't just about the physical changes outside of us. It was about how those changes were being mirrored back within us. But if we lack words and terminology and concepts to understand and identify those things and share them, perhaps we're not seeing them for the prevalence at which they're occurring. And maybe that is part of the problem. So I started to travel with this idea in mind. I went to Paradise, California, where the campfire decimated that town last November. I spent time with people like Gwen Norgren. We see her sitting by the pool of her former home. She used to come out through these double doors, cut across the walkway, dive into the pool, float on her back, and look at this beautiful blue California sky. I spent time with Don Criswell, sixth-generation Paradisian, deeply devoted to the town, deeply imbued with its sense of place. Don plays the piano. He played all over town, the bars, restaurants, lodges. He used to play at the Rocky Mountain Smokehouse here. You can see that on the left. Don and I talked a lot about what it was like to lose that place, what that stress and experience was like, what community meant, what rebuilding was going to mean. Traveled high up into the Andes Mountains in Peru with members of towards the Coyariti Festival, which is the Snowstar Festival, with members of the Quechua community. This is an annual pilgrimage that occurs to worship the Lord of the Ice, the Lord of Coyariti, which resides in a series of glaciers that are melting at a rapid pace. Here we see Pablitos at the base of the glaciers before the ceremony at dawn. Talked about the emotional role and the spiritual dimensions of seeing these changes. Traveled to the far edge of the Russian Arctic, where coastal members of the Chukchi community are deeply reliant on a healthy marine ecosystem around them, both for sustenance, like we see here, the hunting of marine mammals like walruses, but also for a strong sense of identity. Those community leaders are noticing an inconsistent formation of sea ice these days, which has dire implications for the ecosystem, the health of the breeding grounds and resting grounds for Pacific walruses. And I spent time at the coast of Louisiana on Isle de Jean Charles. It's a small island, gets smaller each year. It's a place where coastal erosion and rising sea levels have conspired to take nearly 90% of this island over the last 50 years. And there I met Chantel Commerdale. We see Chantel sitting with her father, Boyo, and her son in this picture. This is 4 generations of her family, a 5th represented in the pictures on the wall. Chantel's 37, and she shared with me some really interesting observations about the sense of and the shape and contours of this loss and what it's meant to her. And I'd like to let her speak for herself here. Oops.
Going through this process, we've met other communities, and there's a community in Alaska who's had the same thing. And we were able to sit down and talk about things, and it was almost exactly the same feelings, the same emotion that they went through. It was like, oh, okay, so I'm not alone. This isn't just something I'm making up in my mind, you know. It was real. It became real.
It became real. And it became real in part because Chantel knew that other people were feeling it too, that she wasn't alone. We are social animals. We have a deep need to understand ourselves and others around us and connect over these things. And language is an important part of that. Chantel was able to close the physical distance between herself and that community in Newtok, Alaska. But where that's not possible, words can build some of these bridges. And without them, perhaps we are arguably blind to the prevalence of these experiences and the possibilities of solutions to solve them. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Narrative matters. Good morning. My name is Rue Mapp, founder and CEO of Outdoor Afro. And yes, narrative matters. Thanks, Pete. I didn't see people who looked like me represented in natural spaces as I was growing up, in the same way that my family was enjoying the outdoors. My parents came from Texas and Louisiana in search of the warmth of other suns to California, leaving behind Jim Crow, but bringing with them a love of nature, and importantly, the desire and imperative to connect in nature with others. So while we lived most of the time in Oakland, California, we had this beautiful ranch about 100 miles north in Lake County, in this beautiful savanna of oak rolling woodlands. And it was truly my laboratory, but it was also a place where we brought family together, just as you see depicted in this picture, for all kinds of celebrations. But I can remember how excited I was to jump out of the car when we arrived at the ranch and head to our local creek to find out what was new. Had the tadpole turned into a frog? Were the rushing rivers trickling down in the heat of summer? And back at the ranch, I noticed what was in bloom, what was ready to be picked and eaten and perhaps canned. And I had a very rich connection to environmental education through the Girl Scouts. And yeah, these are 2 pages from my diary, where I write in big, loopy cursive how much I loved the Girl Scouts and how much I loved camping. But everything came together for me several years later. I was an outward bound student, and I thought I could do mountaineering. Since I had this long connection to the outdoors, why not try it? But I found myself starfished on the side of this mountain in Sequoia Kings. And I was about to give up when my instructor, who did not give up on me, and neither did that mountain, my instructor leaned over and said the magic words, "Rue, trust your feet." And there was something magical about those words that empowered me to scramble up to the top. And that was the moment that I understood nature as a powerful teacher, there to teach me exactly the lesson I needed to learn. At the precipice of adulthood, I needed to know that I had what I needed already inside of me to move forward. Even if I didn't know what was ahead of me or what just happened, that I could continue to move forward, and I'm still trusting my feet. So things came together for me several years later. I wanted to do something different professionally, and I had a mentor ask me the question that I think everyone should ask or answer. And that is, if time and money were not an issue, what would you be doing? And I opened my mouth and my life fell out. I said, I'd probably start a website to reconnect African Americans to the outdoors. And Outdoor Afro was born. And it was born at my kitchen table. And I just began to tell the story of growing up wild and how I was connecting my own children, my own 3 children, to wild places and the value that it provided for me. But not only was a blog born, a community of leadership was born. And I'm so proud that using social media, I was able to connect with people who had a narrative very similar to my own and wanted to do something about it. And over the years, we learned from each other, and we grew with each other, And I'm so proud by the ways that we have together shift the visual representation of who gets outside, but importantly, who leads in the outdoors. Thank you. And these are ordinary, everyday men and women. I call them the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. They come from a wide tapestry of professional backgrounds, but they share this fire in their belly to connect others to nature. And we now oversee a participation network spanning 30 states of over 36,000 people. And in a proud moment last year, a group of those leaders summited Mount Kilimanjaro. Again, teaching us that we can find a way to understand life through life's climbs. We're also taking a step back often in our work and remembering our very important history and the ways that we have persisted and overcame in nature, even when nature was hostile to us. We can turn to the plaintive lyrics of Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit to understand that in the not-so-distant past, the outdoors, the wilderness, and trees did not always represent safety for Black people. But we have a new testimony. We have a way today to tell a new narrative through this work. And we have the ability to, just like our foremothers did, lay down our burdens down by that riverside. Outdoor Afro has decided this year that we are going to teach every child in our sphere of influence to learn to swim. Why? Because of Jim Crow, because of decades of exclusion from public pools, from beaches and coastal areas, we have a public health crisis where African American children are drowning at 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. And because we've built this trust and this network, it's time for us to convert that into action. And we know that if a child doesn't know how to swim, they're not gonna put a pole in a lazy lake. They're not going to take a ride in a canoe. And they're certainly not gonna care about plastic in the ocean. So we're very thankful for all the ways that we can turn to nature for healing and community, just as my parents did. And take the time to get to know our species that surround us and our relationship with them. And this picture here really touches me. This is a picture of Barbara and her daughter through Outdoor Afro experiencing snow for the very first time. People often ask me, what will it look like when your work is done, Rue, when our work is done? I don't think it's going to be a Main Street parade with tickers falling from the sky. It may not appear on the cover of a national magazine. I think it's going to be this quiet moment when we all look up and we see people outside recreating, protecting, healing in nature in proportion to their population and their opportunity. And it's no big deal. Thank you.